Video games are now a central part of global entertainment, but their origins are relatively recent. They did not begin as an industry or even a form of mass entertainment. Instead, they emerged from small scale experiments in the mid 20th century, created by scientists working with early computer systems. It's from these simple beginnings, basic visual displays with limited interaction, that video games developed rapidly. Within a few decades, they moved from laboratories to arcades, from arcades into homes, and eventually onto personal devices carried by millions of people. This is the history of how that transformation took place. Welcome to History Unpacked. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. We post every week and we welcome any feedback. The earliest video games were not designed for entertainment. They were experiments, curiosities by scientists working with early computers in the mid 20th century. In 1958, an American physicist named William Higginbotham created something he called tennis for two. It was displayed on a scientific instrument and allowed two players to control a rudimentary tennis match using simple controllers. There was no commercial ambition behind it. It was quite literally a demonstration piece, something to entertain visitors at a research lab. Yet the idea lingered. A decade later, in 1962, a group of students at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology developed Spacewar, a game in which two players controlled spaceships locked in combat orbiting a star. Unlike early experiments, Spacewar spread. Copies were shared across university networks, passed from one machine to another. It became, in a quiet and limited sense, the first video game to gain a following. Still, video games remained confined to laboratories and universities. For most people, they simply did not exist. That changed in the early 1970s. A young engineer named Nolan Bushnell saw something in Spacewar that others had not. He recognized that this was not merely a curiosity, it was a product. In 1971, he created Computer Space, the first commercially available arcade game. It was not a success. The controls were too complex. The public, unfamiliar with the idea of interactive screens, found it confusing. But Bushnell persisted. A year later, he founded a company, Atari, and in 1972, Atari released Pong. Simple, intuitive, instantly understandable. Two paddles, a ball, and a clear objective. It was, in essence, digital table tennis. And this was a success. Arcade machines appeared in bars, restaurants, and amusement venues. Players lined up, coins dropped steadily into machines. A new form of entertainment had arrived, one that required participation, not passive observation. The video games industry had begun. The next step was inevitable. If people were willing to play video games in public, would they play them at home? The answer came quickly. In 1977, Atari released the Atari 2600, a home console that allowed players to insert cartridges and play multiple games on a single device. This was a crucial shift. Until then, games were tied to machines. With cartridges, games became portable, interchangeable, and most importantly, collectible. The living room became a new kind of space. Televisions, once used only for broadcasting, were now interactive. Families gathered not just to watch, but to play. Other companies followed. The market expanded rapidly. By the early 1980s, video games were no longer a novelty. They were a growing industry. But growth, as it often does, brought instability. The early 1980s saw a flood of games. Too many, too quickly. Quality declined, publishers rushed products to market, often unfinished or even poorly designed. Consumers, overwhelmed by choice and disappointed by inconsistency, began to lose trust. One game in particular became emblematic of the problem: E.T. the Extraterrestrial for the Atari 2600. Rushed to release, widely criticized, and commercially disappointing, it became a symbol of excess and mismanagement. By 1983, the industry actually collapsed. Sales plummeted, companies folded, retailers abandoned video games in favor of more reliable products. For a moment, it seemed as though the experiment had failed. Video games, many believed, had been a passing trend. And then a strange thing happened. There was a revival. And this revival came not from the United States, but from Japan. In 1985, a company called Nintendo released the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, in North America. It was carefully designed not just as a console, but as a controlled ecosystem. Nintendo limited the number of games released. It enforced quality standards. It ensured consistency. And crucially, it introduced characters. Not abstract shapes or anonymous spaceships, but figures with identity. Among them was a plumber named Mario. With Super Mario Bros., Nintendo did something new. It offered not just gameplay, but progression, a world, a sense of movement through space and challenge. Players were no longer simply competing for points, they were advancing through levels, overcoming obstacles, and experiencing something closer to a journey. The industry stabilized and then it began to grow again. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, video games had entered a new phase. Competition intensified, companies were no longer simply creating games, they were building brands, identities, and rivalries. The most notable of these was the conflict between Nintendo and Sega. Nintendo, with its colorful characters and family friendly image, dominated the market. Sega positioned itself differently faster, edgier, more aggressive. Its flagship character, Sonic the Hedgehog, was designed as a direct counterpoint to Mario, sleeker, quicker, and in subtle way, more rebellious. The rivalry played out in advertising, in design, and in the preferences of players themselves. For the first time, video games were not just products, they were cultural markers. People did not simply play games, they chose sides. The mid 1990s marked another transformation. Technology advanced, graphics improved, and with these improvements came a shift from two-dimensional gameplay to three-dimensional worlds. The release of the Sony PlayStation in 1994 signaled a turning point. Unlike earlier consoles, it embraced CD technology, allowing for larger, more complex games with richer audio and visual content. Games such as Final Fantasy VII and Metal Gear Solid introduced cinematic storytelling, cutscenes, voice acting, narrative arcs. At the same time, Super Mario 64 demonstrated what 3D movement could feel like fluid, intuitive, exploratory. The player was no longer confined to a flat plane. They moved through space. It was not merely a technical improvement, it changed how games were designed, experienced, and understood. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, another development emerged connectivity. The internet allowed players to interact, not just with machines, but with each other. Massively multiplayer online games such as World of Warcraft created persistent worlds where thousands of players could coexist, cooperate, and compete. Gaming became social in a new way. No longer limited to shared physical spaces, living rooms, arcades, it extended across continents. Consoles followed. The Xbox, introduced by Microsoft in 2001, emphasized online play through services such as Xbox Live. Friends lists, voice chat, online matches, these became standard features. The boundaries between player and audience, between game and community, began to blur. Then came another shift, quieter but perhaps more significant. In the late 2000s, with the rise of smartphones, video games left the confines of consoles and computers entirely. They became portable in a new sense, not through cartridges or discs, but through devices already carried in pockets. Games like Angry Birds or Candy Crush reached audiences who had never considered themselves gamers. The demographic expanded dramatically. Gaming was no longer a specialized activity, it was casual, accessible, ubiquitous. The industry adapted. Business models changed. Free to play games, microtransactions, and digital distribution reshaped how games were created and monetized. Today, video games exist in multiple forms simultaneously. High budget AAA titles offer cinematic experiences with vast worlds and detailed narratives. Independent developers create smaller, more experimental games, often focusing on atmosphere, mechanics, or storytelling in unconventional ways. Online platforms allow players to stream, share, and watch games as entertainment in their own right. In some cases, the audience for a game may be as large as or larger than the number of people who actually play it. Esports, too, have emerged as a global phenomenon. Competitive gaming now fills arenas, attracts sponsorships, and commands audiences in the millions. What began as a flicker on a laboratory screen has become a complex ecosystem, creative, commercial, and cultural. And yet, despite its scale, video games remain in some respects unfinished. New technologies, virtual reality, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, continue to reshape what games can be. The boundaries between game and film, between player and participant, between reality and simulation are now increasingly difficult to define. But perhaps the most striking aspect of video games is not their technology nor their industry, it is their persistence. From smartphones to arcades to global networks, the fundamental idea has remained remarkably consistent: an invitation to interact, to move something, to respond, and to play. In the space of just a few decades, video games have moved from obscurity to centrality. They have survived collapse, reinvented themselves, and expanded into forms that their earliest creators could scarcely have imagined. What began as an experiment became a pastime. What became a pastime grew into an industry, and what is now an industry continues quietly to evolve. The dot and the line are still there in a sense, only now they exist within worlds. And these worlds increasingly are what people choose to spend their time.